Okie dokie. 23 March. The Autonomous Collective, it's 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Weekly Marx. Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 15. This is the 2024 Princeton University edition, translated by the two Pauls. Now, today I'll start differently. I will begin with the equivalent notes from Harry Cleaver's text on Marx, a study guide to Marx. So in the prior version, English version, it's chapter 17, but the titles are generally the same. Similarly, next week we will look at the next two chapters because I think I can do that on one day. And so for the 2024 edition, it will be chapters 16 and 17. And to confuse you further, if you're using an older version like the Penguin edition, it will be chapters 18 and 19. So that makes it perfectly clear. Needless to say, they resemble each other, but as I've said, the Princeton edition is slightly easier to read. It just reads a little bit in a more contemporary idiomatic English. And if you're teaching it to students, that just makes it easier, less clunky from a 19th century point of view. So here's the Cleaver outline. Relative magnitudes of surplus value S and price of labor power LP are a function of the length of the working day, the intensity of labor, and the productivity of labor. Subsection 1, when only the productivity of labor varies, total value remains the same. The value of labor power and surplus value vary inversely. Although their variation is inverse, the proportionate changes might differ. Variation in magnitude of surplus is always a consequence of a change in value of labor power. Amount of reduction in price of labor power depends on the struggle over the fruits of the increase in productivity. Increasing productivity can result in both workers and capitalists getting more. So, both constant and falling prices of labor power can be accompanied by a rise in real standard of living. Subsection 2, when only intensity of labor varies, the greater intensity means more output, but also more value. So there's ultimately no change in value per unit. Increased intensity of labor means workers get tired faster, the increasing cost of maintaining the same quality of labor power. So the price in the labor power might not fully compensate for its deterioration. Number 3, when only the length of the working day varies, and we saw this in the prior chapter, if shortened and value of labor power remains the same, surplus value is reduced. Shortening may follow or precede an increase in productivity. Now, if lengthened and the value of labor power remains the same, surplus is increased, both absolutely and relatively. But both the price of labor power and surplus can increase. The proportion depends on struggle. Lengthening depletes workers' labor power so that the value of labor power rises. Wage increases may compensate, but as in the case of increased intensity, not completely. With simultaneous variations, there are two important cases. A decline in productivity, an increase in the working day. An increase in working day can compensate for a negative impact on surplus value of a decline in productivity. 1799 to 1815, there was a fall in real wages, the standard of living. This is during, sort of the war with the Napoleonic Wars, right? West and Ricardo were wrong that declining productivity lowered surplus. Surplus rose because of increased hours of work and increased intensity of labor. B, in terms of two important cases, A and B, this is B, the shortening of the working day, but increasing intensity and productivity. The more a working day is intensified and productivity increased, the greater the shortening possible. Also, capitalism limits shortening because of its need for surplus value, so there's a constraint. Capitalism squanders labor power and means of production on socially superfluous functions. As necessary labor declines, potential free time expands. That's sort of the positive point from this chapter. The end of capitalism will make possible the end of leisure for some at the expense of work by others, the universality of labor, but more leisure for all. And, you could even project, fully automated luxury communism. Um, so that's the kind of way you can extrapolate from that, as some have. Let me begin with the reading of the chapter, and we'll see how far we get. I will point out, of course, that I've added, and besides the Harry Cleaver outline, which I just read, the Ed George notes on this chapter, which are also quite useful because he kind of, compresses everything and makes the numbers clearer, because often, despite the translation, adding and subtracting numbers on the fly can be difficult for some people. So you get a kind of clearer sense of that. But fortunately, this is not one of the Ed George chapter where he plows through the numbers and even throws in calculus. So he doesn't do that very often. Chapter 15, Karl Marx, Volume 1, Capital, Chapter 15. The price of labor power and the magnitude of surplus value increase and decrease. In part 3 of this book, chapter 7, we analyze the rate of surplus value, but only from the standpoint of the production of absolute surplus value. In part 4, we're now in part 5, we identified additional determining factors. Here, we will briefly summarize the essential parts of those discussions. The value of labor power is determined by the means of subsistence that the average worker customarily requires. Although the worker doesn't always consume the same means of subsistence, the total amount he consumes is given at any particular moment in any given society, and we will therefore treat this amount as a constant magnitude. Now, what changes is the value of his means of subsistence. Two other factors play a role in determining labor power's value. One is how much it costs to develop labor power. This varies as the mode of production does. The second factor has to do with the natural differences among the bearers of labor power, whether they're male or female, children or adults. Which bearers of labor power are used, something that is also conditioned by the mode of production, greatly affects how much it costs to reproduce a worker's family and the value of an adult male worker. Nevertheless, we will disregard these two factors here. We are assuming, number one, that commodities are sold at their value, and number two, that the price of labor power sometimes rises above its value, but never falls below it. Actually, these are the same as some microeconomic constraints. So, there is a micro theory sort of built in here. With these assumptions in place, we found that three things determine the relative magnitudes of surplus value and labor power's price. The length of the workday, or labor's extensive magnitude, labor's normal intensity or intensive magnitude, i.e., how much labor is expended in a given amount of time, and finally, labor's productive power, i.e., how much product a given amount of labor produces in a given amount of time, which in turn depends on how advanced the conditions of production are. Now, it's obvious that we can have very different combinations of these circumstances. One of these three factors might vary, or two might vary while one remains constant, or all three might vary. The possible combinations are made even more numerous by the fact that when all three factors vary at the same time, they can change by different amounts and in different directions, rising or falling. In what follows, we will consider only the most important considerations. Important combinations, I'm sorry to say. A, the magnitude of the workday and the intensity of labor remain constant, that is fixed, and labor's productive power varies. In this case, three laws determine labor power's value and the magnitude of surplus value. First, a workday with a fixed magnitude will always be represented in the same amount of value produced, regardless of whether labor's productivity changes, causing the total amount of product produced and the price of each individual commodity to change. Let's say that the value produced during a 12-hour workday amounts to 12 shillings. Although the number of use values produced may vary as labor's productive power increases or decreases, this 6 shillings of value will remain constant. It will simply be distributed among more commodities or fewer. Second, labor power's value and the magnitude of surplus value vary in inverse relation to each other. When the productive power of labor changes, rising or falling, this causes the magnitude of labor power's value to change in the opposite direction, but the magnitude of surplus value to change in the same direction. The value produced during a 12-hour workday is once again a constant value of 6 shillings. This constant value equals the sum of the surplus value and the value of the labor power that the worker replaces with an equivalent. Clearly, one of the two parts of a constant magnitude can become larger only if the other part becomes smaller. The value of the labor power can increase from 3 shillings to 4 only if the magnitude of the surplus value produced falls from 3 shillings to 2, and vice versa. Under such conditions, the absolute magnitude of both the labor power's value and the surplus value won't change if their relative magnitudes do not change simultaneously. These magnitudes cannot both rise or fall at the same time. So there's a mathematical thing going on here, right? Labor power's value will decrease, moreover, allowing the surplus value to be enlarged only if labor's productive power increases. To stay with the example given above, the labor power's value will decrease from 3 shillings to 2 only if greater productive power makes it possible to produce in 4 hours an amount of the worker's means of subsistence that formerly took 6 hours of labor to produce. Now, the reverse is also true. The labor power's value won't increase from 3 hours to 4 unless the productive power of labor contracts, and 8 hours are needed to produce an amount of the worker's means of subsistence that used to be produced in only 6 hours. When labor's productive power changes in a given direction, say when it rises, labor power's value and the amount of surplus value are affected in opposite ways, that is, decreasing and increasing respectively. Ricardo overlooked one thing in formulating this law. So note, this is like one of the issues that a lot of people have with, transporting or transposing Ricardo's labor theory of value to Marx. Ricardo overlooked one thing in formulating this law. The magnitude of surplus value or the surplus labor can change only if the magnitude of labor power's value and thus the amount of necessary labor change in the opposite direction. But it doesn't at all follow from this that the proportions in which surplus labor and necessary labor change will be the same. They will, of course, be enlarged or reduced by the same amount, but the relative magnitude of each side's increase or decrease, i.e. the magnitude of the change as a proportion of the original magnitude, depends on how the workday was divided before labor's productive power was altered. Let's say that the labor power's value was originally 4 shillings and the necessary labor time was 8 hours, while the surplus value amounted to 2 shillings and the surplus labor to 4 hours. Now, the productive power of labor increases, causing the labor power's value to fall to 3 shillings and the necessary labor time to contract to 6 hours. The surplus value would increase to 3 shillings and the surplus labor to 6 hours. The same amount added on one side, 1 shilling or 2 hours, falls away on the other side. But the same change represents a different proportion of the original value on each side, whereas the labor power's value decreases from 4 shillings to 3, and thus by 1/4 or 25%. The surplus value increases from 2 shillings to 3 by 1/2 or 50%. So you see disproportionate or proportionate difference. So the greater the part of the workday originally represented in surplus value, the less surplus value increases or decreases proportionally when labor's productive power changes and vice versa. I know that's as clear as mud to some folks. Third, when the amount of surplus value changes, this is always caused by and never the cause of a corresponding increase or decrease in the magnitude of labor power's value, since the length of the workday is fixed and the workday is represented in a constant amount of value. With every change in the amount of surplus value produced corresponding to an equal change in the magnitude of labor power's value only in the opposite direction. And since the value of labor power can vary only if labor's productive power does, it clearly follows that under these conditions, every change in the amount of surplus value produced arises from a change in the magnitude of labor power's value. If we saw earlier that the magnitude of labor power's value and the amount of surplus value can't change in absolute terms unless their relative magnitudes change, we see here that their relative magnitudes can't change unless labor power's value changes in absolute terms. Now, Ricardo was the first to rigorously formulate these 3 laws, but his account is also flawed in the following ways. Number 1, he treats the particular conditions under which these laws are valid as self-evident, universal, and exclusive conditions of capitalist production. Number 2, much more damaging to his analysis is that he doesn't give a pure account of surplus value, i.e., consider it apart from its particular form, such as profit, ground rent, and so on, and thus he jumbles together the laws governing the rate of surplus value and the laws that govern the profit rate. In Book 3 of this work, Promises, I will show that one and the same rate of surplus value can be expressed in very different rates of profit, and under certain circumstances, very different rates of surplus value can be expressed as one and the same rate of profit. According to the 3rd law, the magnitude of surplus value can change only if labor's productive power increases or decreases, thereby causing the value of labor power to go up or down. How much the amount of surplus value produced can change is determined by labor power's new value limit. Yet, even when circumstances allow this law to operate, certain subsidiary movements can occur. Suppose labor's productive power is increased, and as a result, the labor power's value falls from 4 shillings to 3, or, that is, the necessary labor time decreases from 8 hours to 6. The price of the labor power can fall only to 3 shillings, 8 pence, 3 shillings, 6 pence, 3 shillings, 2 pence, and so on, which means that the surplus value can only increase to 3 shillings, 4 pence, 3 shillings, 6 pence, 3 shillings, 10 pence, and so on. The new price must be at least 3 shillings. It can't fall beyond that point, and how far it falls depends on how much pressure the capitalists apply from one side compared with how much resistance the workers mount from the other. The value of labor power is determined by a certain quantity of the worker's means of subsistence. When the productive power of labor changes, it is the value of these means of subsistence that changes, not their volume. Their volume can, in fact, increase for both worker and the capitalist at the same time and in a proportionally equal way, because labor's productive power has increased while neither the price of labor power nor the amount of surplus value that is produced changes. Imagine that the labor power's original value is 3 shillings and that the necessary labor time is 6 hours. Let's also imagine that the value of the surplus labor performed is 3 shillings too, and that the amount performed is 6 hours. If labor's productive power doubled, but the division of the workday remained the same, neither the magnitude of the surplus value nor the labor power's price would change. They would simply be represented in twice as many commodities that are now half as expensive. Furthermore, since the labor power's price hasn't changed, its price would exceed its new value. Now, suppose the labor power's price falls, not the, not the, not the all the way to its new minimum limit of 1.5 shillings, which is set by its new value, but to 2 shillings 10 pence, or 2 shillings 6 pence. This falling price would still represent a growing quantity of the means of subsistence. Thus, it can happen that when labor's productive power increases, the price of labor power keeps dropping, even as the amount of the worker's means of subsistence keeps getting larger. However, labor power's value would keep decreasing in relative terms, i.e., compared with the amount of surplus value produced, and so the gulf between the life circumstances of capitalists and the life circumstances of workers would continue to widen. The magnitude of the workday, B, and labor's productive power are constant, and labor's intensity varies. When labor is performed with increasing intensity, more labor is expended in a given amount of time. A more intense workday is thus embodied in more products than a less intense one of the same length. Now, of course, a workday can also yield more products than before because labor's productive power is increased. But when that happens, the value of each individual product decreases since each product now requires less labor. Whereas when labor becomes more intense, a product's value remains the same since the amount of labor needed to produce it doesn't change. The number of products goes up, but the price of each product doesn't fall. Here, the price sum of the products increases as the number of them does, whereas in the other case, the same value sum is merely represented in a greater number of products. So, if the length of the workday remains constant, a more intense day will be embodied in a greater amount of newly produced value, or if the value of money doesn't change, in a greater amount of money. The amount of value produced by such a workday varies according to how much the day's intensity deviates from the social norm. A workday of fixed length is now represented in a variable amount of newly produced value rather than a constant one. For example, a more intense 12-hour day might be represented in 7 or 8 shillings instead of the 6 shillings in which a workday of normal intensity is represented. Clearly, if the amount of value produced in a workday increases from 6 shillings to 8, both components of that value product, that is, the price of labor power and the surplus value, can grow at the same time, either by the same amount or to varying extents. They could both increase from 3 shillings to 4 if the value produced were to go from 6 shillings to 8. But in this case, the labor power's price, upon increasing, wouldn't necessarily exceed its value. Labor power's price can, in fact, fall below the value of labor power and rise at the same time, which is what always happens when the price of labor power increases, but not so much as to make up for its accelerated deterioration. So, yes, Marx is giving you the kind of basic elements of, what counts as present value, what counts as depreciation, et cetera, et cetera. We know that notwithstanding some temporary exceptions, changes in labor's productivity cause the value of labor power to change, and thereby alter the magnitude of surplus value produced, only when the affected branches of industry help make the workers' customary means of subsistence. But this qualification falls away here. When labor's extent or intensity varies, the amount of value it produces always varies accordingly, regardless of whether the value is represented in this or that kind of product. If the intensity of labor increased in all branches of industry at the same time and by an equal amount, The result would be society's new normal intensity, and it would no longer add to labor's extensive magnitude. Now, even then, however, labor's average intensity would differ from nation to nation, making for a variety in the application of the law of value to different nations. One nation's more intense workday would be represented in a greater amount of money than another's less intense workday. And yes, it is quite true, the global south does probably put in more hours, or at least at different times, and has third shifts and a whole bunch of other things for a comparable set of workdays in the global north. C, labor's productive power and intensity remain constant, and we vary the length of the workday. Now, the workday can vary in two directions. It can be shortened or extended. When labor's productive power and intensity remain the same, shortening the workday doesn't alter the value of labor power and thus the necessary labor time, but it does reduce the amount of surplus labor performed and surplus value created. As the latter magnitude decreases in absolute terms, it contracts in relative ones as well. In other words, the magnitude of the surplus value decreases relative to that of labor power's value, which doesn't change. The capitalist who finds himself in this situation can avoid adverse effects only by driving labor power's price below its value. All traditional arguments against shortening the workday assume that it is shortened under the conditions we've been presupposing. In reality, however, the opposite happens. The workday is compressed, either right before labor's productivity and intensity change or just after that. And this is one problematic assumption that we'll see elsewhere, and of course is one often reflected in problematic demands for decreasing the work week. Extending the workday. Suppose the necessary labor time amounts to 6 hours and the labor power is valued to 3 shillings. Let's say the same holds for the surplus labor and the surplus value respectively. The total workday thus lasts 12 hours and is represented in 6 shillings of newly produced value. If the workday were extended by 2 hours with no change in the price of labor power, the relative magnitude of the surplus value would increase along with its absolute magnitude. Now, although the labor power's magnitude of value wouldn't change in absolute terms, it would decrease in relative terms. Under the conditions we presupposed in section A above, labor power's relative magnitude of value can change only if its absolute value changes. Here, in contrast, the magnitude of the labor power's value changes in relative terms because the magnitude of the surplus value changes in absolute ones. Since the workday produces and is represented in a greater quantity of value when it is extended, labor power's price and the magnitude of surplus value can increase at the same time, whether or not by the same amount. Such a simultaneous increase can occur in two scenarios. That is, when the absolute length of the workday is extended and when that doesn't happen, but labor's intensity increases. When the workday is extended, labor power's price can fall below its value even as its price nominally remains the same, or in fact rises. Labor power's daily value is estimated, as we will recall, based on two things. First, its normal average duration, i.e. the worker's normal life expectancy, and second, the corresponding normal amount of the worker's living substance that is converted into motion without exceeding what is consonant with the nature of human beings. Now, so there's this shift here in the argument, and this will take a lot of work probably further on. Labor power inevitably deteriorates faster when the workday is extended, but up to a certain point, this accelerated wearing down can be compensated for with higher wages. Beyond that point, however, labor power deteriorates faster and faster in a geometrical progression, which destroys all the normal conditions of its reproduction and activation. The price of labor power and the extent to which it is exploited are no longer commensurable magnitudes. D, labor's duration, productive power, and intensity all vary. As we can see, there are many possible combinations here. Two factors can vary while one doesn't, or all three can vary at the same time. They can vary by the same amount or different amounts, and also in the same direction or different directions, with the changes offsetting one another partially or fully. Yet it is easy to analyze all the possible scenarios using the cases worked out in sections A, B, and C. We will arrive at the result of every possible combination by treating one factor after another as the only factor that varies. Ceteris paribus. Thus, we will limit ourselves in this chapter to briefly considering two important scenarios. Let's see. Scenario one. Labor's productive power decreases as the workday is extended. For the moment, we're interested in the decreased productive power only insofar as it affects branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power. For example, a loss of productive power that occurs because the soil has become less fertile and thus makes agricultural products more expensive. Let's say the workday is 12 hours and produces value worth 6 shillings. Half the value replaces the labor power's value, the other half is surplus value. Here then, the workday is divided into two equal parts, that is, 6 hours of necessary labor and 6 hours of surplus labor. But now, the prices of agricultural products rise. As a result, the labor power's value increases from 3 shillings to 4 shillings, causing the necessary labor time to go from 6 hours to 8 hours. Now, if the length of the workday remains constant, the surplus labor will decrease from 6 hours to 4, and the amount of surplus value will be reduced from 3 shillings to 2, correspondingly. If the workday is extended by 2 hours, or from 12 hours to 14 hours, the surplus labor will continue to amount to 6 hours, and 3 shillings of surplus value will still be produced, but the relative magnitude of the surplus value will decrease. The amount of surplus value produced will become smaller relative to the magnitude of the labor power's value, as measured by necessary labor time. On the other hand, if the workday is extended by 4 hours, or from 12 hours to 16, the proportional magnitudes of the surplus value and the labor power's value won't change, and neither will the ratio of surplus value to necessary labor. But the absolute magnitude of the surplus value will increase from 3 shillings to 4, and that of the surplus labor will increase from 6 hours to 8, or by 1/3 or 33%, so that when labor's productive power declines and the workday is extended at the same time, the absolute magnitude of the surplus value can remain constant while its proportional magnitude contracts. Furthermore, the proportional magnitude of the surplus value can stay the same as its absolute magnitude is enlarged. And depending on how much the workday is extended, both things can increase simultaneously. This is one of the reasons why England saw the amount of surplus value increase both absolutely and relatively. And thus, capital's growth accelerate while the workers were being immiserated during the period between 1799 and 1815. At just this time, the freedom to heedlessly exploit labor became a civil right. And West, Ricardo, and others seized upon the idea that the rate of surplus value had fallen because the cost of agricultural products had risen, using this action as their point of departure in influential analyses. See Corn Law. However, the price increase they made so much of had that effect only in their heads, as opposed to reality. Now, the second, labor's intensity and productive power increase as the workday is shortened. Now, in one respect, the same thing happens when labor's productive power increases and when its intensity does. A greater amount of product is produced in a given amount of time. Thus, both increases shorten the part of the workday the worker needs to produce his own means of subsistence or their equivalent. This necessary but contractible part of the workday represents an absolute limit. If the whole workday were to shrink down to its necessary part, surplus value would disappear, something that doesn't occur under the regime of capital. Only if the capitalist mode of production were abolished would it be possible to limit the workday to the part where necessary labor is performed. This is kind of the argument against co-ops, but anyway. But even then, that part would be enlarged, for the worker would enjoy better life circumstances, and so he would expect more from life than the minimum it takes to maintain him. Moreover, a portion of what is now surplus labor would function as necessary labor, since some labor would be needed to bring about a social reserve and accumulation fund. And this is the primitive and capitalist accumulation issue for many people. The more labor's productive power increases, the more the workday can be shortened, and the more the workday is shortened, the more labor's intensity can be increased. Now, from society's perspective, labor's productivity also increases when people work with greater economy, which entails economizing in the use of the means of production, and in addition, avoiding all non-useful labor. The capitalist mode of production does, in fact, force every branch of industry to economize. However, owing to its anarchic system of competition, social means of production and bearers of labor power are squandered in the most egregious ways, and there are countless functions that are currently indispensable, but in themselves unnecessary. So, to conclude, if labor's intensity and productive power are given, then the more evenly labor is divided among all the members of society capable of working, and the less one stratum of society can deflect labor, that natural necessity, onto other people, the shorter the part of the social workday that is needed for material production, and the larger the part that will be won for an individual's free intellectual and social activity. Now, in this case, the absolute limit for shortening the workday is how universal labor can become. Capitalist society, in contrast, affords one class of people free time by turning the whole lives of other people into labor time. And I hope you need to note that today is a golfing day, as was yesterday, for the President of the United States. Footnote 1. McCulloch, among other people, attached the following silly addendum to this third law. He claimed that if the taxes a capitalist pays are abolished, this could increase his surplus value without causing labor power's value to decrease. But abolishing such taxes wouldn't change a thing with respect to the amount of surplus value that the industrial capitalist directly squeezes out of the worker. It would only change how that amount is distributed, i.e., how much of it goes into his own pocket and how much he shares it with a third person. Thus, it wouldn't affect the ratio between the value of labor power and the surplus value. McCulloch's exception shows only that he doesn't understand the rule. In vulgarizing Ricardo, he suffers this fate as often as J.B. Say had in vulgarizing Adam Smith. Footnote 2. When an alteration takes place in the productiveness of industry, and that either more or less is produced by a given quantity of labor and capital, the proportion of wages may obviously vary, while the quantity which that proportion represents remains the same, or the quantity may vary whilst the proportion remains the same. That's from Outlines of Political Economy. Footnote 3. All things being equal, the English manufacturer can turn out a considerably larger amount of work in a given time frame than a foreign manufacturer, so much as to counterbalance the difference of the working days between 60 hours a week here and 72 or 80 elsewhere. Now, the surest way to reduce this difference between the continental labor hour and the English one would be to enact strong legislation limiting the workday in factories on the continent. Number 4. There are compensating circumstances which the working of the 10 Hours Act has brought to light. Recall that, that there are governmental legislations being brought forward because of, people's political interests. Number four, there are compensating circumstances which the working of the 10 Hours Act has brought to light. Number five, the amount of labor which a man had undergone in the course of 24 hours might be approximately arrived at by an examination of the chemical changes which had taken place in his body, changed forms in matter, indicating the anterior exercise of dynamic force. Footnote 6. A principal cause of the increase of capital during the war proceeded from the greater exertions and perhaps the greater privations of the laboring classes, the most numerous in every society. More women and children were compelled by necessitous circumstances to enter upon laborious occupations, and former workmen were, from the same cause, obliged to devote a greater proportion of their time to increase production. Footnote 7. Now, this is a long one, but it sort of sets some of the issues. Corn and labor rarely march quite abreast, but there's an obvious limit beyond which they cannot be separated. With regard to the unusual exertions made by the laboring classes in periods of dearness, which produce the fall of wages noticed in the evidence, namely before the parliamentary committees of inquiry of 1814 to 15, they are most meritorious in the individuals and certainly favor the growth of capital. But no man of humanity could wish to see them constant and unremitted. They are the most admirable as a temporary relief, but if they were constantly in action, effects of a similar kind would result from them, as from the population of a country being pushed to the very extreme limits of its food. This is a reference to Malthus. It is to Malthus's credit that he emphasizes the importance of extending the workday, which he addresses directly elsewhere in his pamphlet too, whereas in the face of conspicuous facts suggesting otherwise. Ricardo and others make the workday's constant magnitude the basis of all their investigations, and yet the conservative interest that Malthus was a slave to prevented him from seeing that the heedless extension of the workday, combined with extraordinary advances in machinery and the exploitation of female and child labor, would make a large part of the working class superfluous, especially once the demand created by war had ceased and England had lost its monopoly over the world market. It was naturally much more convenient and much more in line with the interests of the ruling class, a group Malthus idolized in a downright sacerdotal manner, to explain overpopulation using the eternal laws of nature than it was to do using the laws of capitalist production that are merely part of natural history. So that's chapter 15. Karl Marx, Capital Volume 1, the 2024 edition. I hope that you can see that it reads a little better. I will note, of course, here that Ed George squares away the numbers a little better, I think, in terms of, working through the addition and subtraction in estimating the differential between work days that are the disproportionality that is possible in such a system. Not that it does always, but that it can. And the one point that he made, last case, for example, where a sharp rise in the means of subsistence stood insufficiently compensated for by a nominal rise in wages. Out of the state of affairs, Ricardo and others incorrectly concluded that a fall in the rate of surplus value had taken place. In fact, however, surplus value increased both absolutely and relatively, thanks to an increase in the intensity of labor and to a gradualized lengthening of the working day. So there's a war economy argument that's sort of sitting there as well. And then in the Harry Cleaver notes, there's an amusing comment. Marx draws our attention to two cases: the Napoleonic Wars, actual war between the British and French governments began in 1803, finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815 after his disastrous withdrawal from Moscow, and despite Britain's defeat in the War of 1812 in the United States. Remember, Britain is fighting, it's doing a lot of things during this period. During those years of warfare, the ability of England to import grain from the European continent was curtailed both by the French government's closing of its territory to British trade and by the British naval blockade of French ports. As a result, the British economy was forced to rely on less productive local agriculture, especially of corn, that is the English term for wheat and other grains requiring grinding. And note that this is the issue of, water power to grind, corn or grind wheat to make bread. The resulting increase in the price of bread for workers helped drive them to accept the longer, harder hours that Marx cites. The increasing price of grain and bread not only reduced real wages, but increased ground rents, profiting landlords. This situation was prolonged after the war by so-called corn laws enacted in 1815, putting tariffs on imported grain. The continued high price of grain and bread intensified class conflicts and led to the famous debate between Malthus, who defended the tariffs as vital to national security, and Ricardo, who critiqued them as harmful to industrial development because they diverted income from profits that could be invested to rents that went largely to luxury consumption by landlords. Capitalists mounted a sustained movement enlisting workers to end the corn laws. Note how long this took, though. Increase wheat imports and lower the price of bread, an effort that finally succeeded in 1846. Now, of course, they didn't mention to the workers their plans to lower wages once the price of bread dropped. Anyway, there's a second case I won't read. I thank you for your interest. Let's see if there are comments. Ooh, vulgarizing permutations. Um, yeah. Anyway, I'll stop share and the live stream. I will note, of course, that in an hour or so, a little less than an hour, at the top of the hour, there will be Star Trek: The Next Generation, a good episode. Um, One that has, in fact, a similar set of relations that is showing the relations between those of trade or the relations of trade, and in particular, certain constraints on the issue of trade imposed by a certain kind of a dependency built from two sides. Let's put it that way. And I'm not um, giving any spoilers away. So let me thank you for your attention, and